Here are 4 great books that I read in April that I think you should too. And first up is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This is a fantastically written book from a literary perspective. I think the story as a whole is great, and also just the way he writes. It's almost Shakespearean in that manner, and that's also shown in the theme selection. It's very sort of reminiscent of Macbeth, of Othello, and also of Hamlet. He's managed to take that style and update it to the modern times for Dumas. And so we're talking about the Napoleonic era. And you see that in the theme selection as well. So when we're talking about the vice that ambition can be, it's very clearly linked to Napoleon, and also how he tried to play God and bend Europe to his will. And we see that the Count now takes that role of playing God as well. And the vices and the tragedy that that can lead to. Obviously in Napoleon in 1812, but then with the Count as he starts to go a little bit too far with his revenge. And it's interesting because at the start you root for him. You want him to get back at those who have wronged him, who have sort of ruined his life for 20 plus years, causing him to rot in a prison cell. But then it becomes a moment where you have that turning point and you just start to question, maybe this is going too far. And I was supporting that. I was on board with this. So what does that say about me as well? It's an interesting book, and it's a challenging one, in particular upon 2 themes. Obviously we have the warnings against jealousy, against ambition, against greed, and where that can lead. But there are 2 themes on top of that as well. One is to do with identity and to do with masks, really. And what does the Count of Monte Cristo mean? It's a title that he's given himself. There is no heritage to it. There is no meaning attached to it. There's nothing. The same for a lot of the other characters who are introduced at the start of the novel. And then we see where they end up. We see the titles that they now hold. And there's a sentence in there where it says that the king could make him a peer of the realm, but it'd never make him a gentleman. And that's one of the essences of the novel. That you can have these titles, you can have all this wealth, all this luxury around you, but it doesn't change your character. It doesn't change who you are. And if you have vices within your character, then you can be sure that the Count is going to exploit them. And perhaps the downfall is your own. The second aspect is to do with justice. It's to do with where the origin of justice is. Again, considering the historical context, it's quite interesting, as you had a lot of regime changes at this time. You could be committing a crime in one, and then you could be a hero in another. And that's the question, really. Where does justice come from? Is there an ordained right way to do things, a universal morality? Is it decided by the society, or by the individual? Where does it really come from? And can someone take it in their hands and play God? And can they get away with it? Sticking with the theme of universal morality, we come to The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. And a quote that was within here was that I thought, and by society standards, my life was going uphill, when in reality, it was going downhill. The character of Ivan Ilyich rushed into a marriage. He thought that it would be pleasing for society, that it would be good for his reputation, when his marriage started failing, because he wasn't willing to acknowledge the responsibility that he had within that, and he wasn't willing to devote the time that it needed. He tried to dive into his work, and when it was going well, when he was being promoted, it was all fine. When he was a bit too ambitious, a bit too greedy, and wanted more, and thought that he was deserving of more, it would go badly. And so from there he turned to the material. He tried to dress up his house, get the most expensive furniture, the most lavish furnishings. And yet that didn't make him happy either. He wanted to get more things, more material, better positions, a better reputation within society. But it wasn't forthcoming. And it ended that in that pursuit, he got his fatal injury. And that is what led him to his deathbed. His colleagues didn't care about him. They didn't care about his death. They were just interested in the position that they might now be able to take, now that his position had been freed. His wife was only interested in the money that she could get from his death. No one loved him. No one cared about his death, except perhaps for his son, the only one that he perhaps truly loved as well. However, when it came to his death, he realised that there were still things that he could do. There were ways that he could change his mindset, and perhaps look outwards for once, and make a difference there. And maybe that's what helped him find peace. The whole novel is really him questioning, what is a good life? And is there a right way that I should be living my life? Because clearly, where he ended up, he felt he had lived the wrong life. So again, we see the similarities between The Count of Monte Cristo and The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Is there a universal morality in terms of justice, but also in terms of the way that we live our own lives? This is the question that Tolstoy often asks. And we see Pierre, the character which asks this in War and Peace. And we see that Levin is a character that asks this in Anna Karenina. Ivan joins them as really Tolstoy's mouthpieces that he uses to explore, really, the meaning of life. So within The Death of Ivan Ilyich, as it's only 90 pages, we really have Tolstoy's philosophy boiled down. It has less of the atmosphere and the ambience that we have within his longer novels. So if you do maybe want a primer into Tolstoy's philosophy, The Death of Ivan Ilyich could be a good starting point, and then to go and read Anna Karenina or War and Peace. But I think that if you only read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, you really are missing out on some of the magic of Tolstoy's writing. This is a much more simplified version. It is interesting philosophically, but really to get the richness of a Tolstoy novel, Unfortunately, not getting it in 90 pages, although it's still a great book philosophically. Sticking with the Russians, we have Eugene On Again by Alexander Pushkin. The first thing to note about this book is that it's written in the form of narrative verse. Typically, I don't really like narrative verse. I find they're much harder to follow the plot, as I tend to, I'm not sure, but kind of get carried away with the rhythm and the pacing of the poetry. And so I find myself reading a lot without really absorbing anything. And it was the same with Eugene On Again. I found that I was getting quite lost in the beginning. However, what made a change for me was when I decided to really focus on a particular theme. And as it's with Pushkin, love was the most obvious. He's quite well known for his love poetry. And so focusing on that really helped me stay a bit more grounded within the story. And the more I read, the more I enjoyed it, the better I was able to follow the plot, and the more, I suppose, I got out of the book. And what I did get out was really the theme of nihilism, which is quite a strong theme within Dostoevsky's work and with a lot of the writers in the 19th century regarding Russia. Here we see how nihilism and really boredom brings two people together, causes them to fall out, revenge to be taken, the tragedy and the realization it's only when it's lost that value is assigned and that the value is truly seen. Pushkin is a fantastic writer and his short stories are excellent. I would highly recommend them. I would also recommend Eugene On Again if you're not so averse to narrative verse. It might take a bit of time to get used to, but it's well worth it. I don't think Pushkin's Eugene On Again is essential reading, as there are other books which deal with these topics. However, there's something about Pushkin's style and the way that he writes. It's almost as if he's there telling you the story and interjecting and really breaking the fourth wall. And that's something that I found within his short stories as well, is that it would come to a point where he'd just say, I'm not going to bore you with description, I'm just going to get straight into the story. And I appreciated that, especially when I contrasted that with Dostoevsky, who's the next author. And the book is Dostoevsky's Demons, because within this he says that he can't go on without giving a description of the, I believe it's a setting and the character. And it was very funny to contrast that, the two different styles that these authors have. Both excellent, I'm not taking away from either of them, but it was interesting to have that dialogue between them. And you do wonder, as they were pretty much contemporaries, whether they were directly referencing each other. And Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky is a much more in-depth exploration of the idea of nihilism compared to Eugene On Again by Pushkin. In Demons, we have a group of nihilistic students who want to tear down society and rebuild it with their own morality and with their own beliefs. They're all fighting for this cause, but really behind the cause is one man, is Peter Stepanovich, and he is the one who is manipulating and making sure that everything is going to his tune. It's not so much that he wants to redesign society for an altruistic reason, but rather he feels contempt for society. He wants to get revenge upon it, revenge against his father and revenge against those who have wronged him. He wants to tear down what they hold dear and rebuild it up in his own image. So we really have two dichotomies within the book. We have the believers versus the nihilists, and we have the manipulated against the manipulating. And we can contrast this with Eugene On Again and also with the Count of Monte Cristo, based on one theme, and that is love. Specifically, the redemptive quality of love. In the Count of Monte Cristo, the Count is bent on this path of revenge. However, he is redeemed by love. In Eugene On Again, we have a similar attempt at love to redeem the character of Eugene. He rejects it, and because of that, he goes on to commit the atrocities that he does. In Demons by Dostoevsky, we do have a redemptive love. However, it's too late. It's not enough. And if anything, that love just adds to the tragedy of the situation. A nihilist who became a believer, who rediscovered their belief and their faith in life, unfortunately is too far gone, is too embroiled with the other nihilists, and because of that, they're doomed to die. Demons is not often spoken about when it comes to Dostoevsky's work. It really tends to focus on Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. However, I think it is quite an underrated one, and one that has a very accessible introduction. It's split into 3 parts, and the first part is really quite witty and funny, focusing on the blunders that different characters are making and the absurdities of the situation. And then as we go into parts 2 and 3, we get a lot more saturation in terms of the ideas that Dostoevsky's presenting. And he does this really with very powerful sentences that aren't taken apart, but left up to the reader to interpret, which, to be honest, is what I prefer when I'm reading. The Idiot is written in the same manner, whereas I find that Crime and Punishment can be quite laborious in terms of its introduction. And I think that Demons is always relevant in terms of how individuals manipulate seemingly altruistic causes to suit their own ends, and they can use virtue to manipulate those who are within the cause for perhaps more altruistic reasons. It's an interesting book, it's a timely book, and really Dostoevsky is someone that I would recommend to anyone, particularly if they look for challenge from what they're reading. There are sentences in here that you can spend weeks unpacking and never really get to the bottom of ideas. However, I do appreciate that that's not for everybody. In contrast, The Death of Ivan Ilyich really does lay out Tolstoy's philosophy. And I would say that Notes from the Underground does do the same for Dostoevsky. So if you want a more expanded version of the philosophies, then those are two books that are quite good to look for. The Count of Monte Cristo equally has the philosophy laid out in a more accessible format that won't necessarily require subsequent thought. As you may have realised, all of the books are from the 19th century, either from France or from Russia. This is my favourite period of literature, and I think it's interesting to note that it was bookended by two revolutions, the French at the end of the 18th and the Russian at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's also interesting to note that the French Revolution led to a flourishing of French literature, whereas the Russian Revolution almost put a stop to it. And I would say that the best Russian literature comes prior to the Russian Revolution. We still do have authors such as Bulgakov and Solzhenitsyn who come post. However, the level of censorship that took place in the Soviet Union means that really it killed off any major flourishing in Russian literature. So while I would recommend these four books very strongly, I would also recommend any coming out of this era in particular. And I think France and Russia really are the main sources, as they were the giants of European culture at the time. So if you are looking for classic strategy or TBR, you can't go wrong with these four. And aside from that, see you in the next one.